The gunner never sees it coming. On a monitor, inside a dugout 6 kilometers away, a howitzer barrel fills the frame, pale green against the thermal feed, steam still curling off the muzzle from the last fire mission. Then, the picture drops, static, for less than half a second. When it clears, the turret is gone. Not damaged, not smoking. Gone, sheared clean off the hull and thrown 11 meters into a wheat field. That single frame is the reason this file exists. The gun in the crosshairs was a 2S-35 Koalitsiya-SV, Russia's newest self-propelled howitzer, a machine the Kremlin's own defense ministry had called effectively immune to drone attack less than a year earlier. It cost somewhere north of $5 million to build. Fewer than 20 of them exist anywhere in the Russian arsenal. On May 27, 2026, on open ground north of Kupiansk, one of them stopped existing. This isn't a story about luck. It's about a 9-man drone unit that spent 6 weeks watching one tree line, a spool of hair-thin fiber-optic cable that no jammer on Earth can touch, and a design choice baked into the Koalitsiya's own autoloader, the very feature Moscow marketed as its greatest advantage. By the end, you'll understand exactly why that crew sat still long enough to die, and why they never saw it coming until the barrel filled someone else's screen. The unit responsible calls itself Achilles. It's the FPV strike company of Ukraine's 92nd Separate Assault Brigade, and it rarely releases footage. What does get out is usually months old, scrubbed of anything that could tell a Russian analyst how the unit actually operates. This file is different. It's built from raw strike logs, radio intercepts, and interviews with 2 of the pilots involved, one of whom flew the drone that found the gun in the first place. His call sign is Sik, owl, in Ukrainian slang for a night shift soldier who never seems to sleep. He's 26. Before the invasion, he repaired agricultural drones for a farming co-op outside Poltava. Now he flies kamikaze quadcopters into Russian armor for a living, and by his own count, he's personally guided strikes on 11 vehicles since January. The Koalitsiya would be his 12th. Kupiansk sits in Kharkiv Oblast, on the west bank of the Oskil River, and by the spring of 2026, it had become one of the ugliest axes on the entire front. Russian forces had been grinding at it for over a year, throwing infantry at the tree lines north and east of the city, in waves that rarely gained more than a few hundred meters, before stalling under Ukrainian fire. What kept those attacks alive was artillery, constant, heavy, and increasingly precise. That's where the Koalitsiya-SV comes in. NATO calls it the 2S-35. It carries a 152mm main gun on a fully enclosed, unmanned turret, fed by an auto-loading carousel that can put 10 to 16 rounds downrange in a single burst before the barrel even needs to cool. A standard high-explosive shell reaches out to roughly 24 kilometers. With rocket-assisted rounds, Russian gunners have claimed ranges past 40. On paper, it's a system built to sit far behind the line and never once come within reach of anything Ukraine can throw back. Russia has fielded fewer than 20 of these guns total, spread across multiple brigades, which makes each individual howitzer disproportionately valuable. State media had run segments on the Koalitsiya for years, calling it the future of Russian fire support, the gun that would finally outrange and outgun anything NATO could send west. Command doctrine, according to intercepted radio traffic reviewed for this file, told crews to keep a minimum standoff of roughly 30 kilometers from any known Ukrainian FPV unit. That number wasn't arbitrary. It was based on the effective range of Ukraine's radio-controlled first-person view drones, which lose their control signal to distance, terrain, and Russian jamming somewhere between 8 and 15 kilometers on a good day. Here's the complication nobody in that Russian battery accounted for. Fiber-optic FPV drones don't use radio at all. The control signal travels down a physical strand of glass thinner than a human hair, spooling out behind the aircraft as it flies. No radio link means nothing to jam. Russia had actually pioneered the concept first, deploying fiber-optic drones along the Kursk axis back in 2024. By early 2026, Ukraine had matched the technology and, in places like Kupiansk, started to overtake it. The 30-kilometer standoff rule that Koalitsiya crews trusted with their lives was written for a threat that no longer matched the battlefield. I spent hours going through the raw intercept transcripts Achilles handed over for this file, and one exchange kept nagging me. A Russian battery commander, call sign redacted, radios his forward observer asking for confirmation the position is, quote, outside drone range, like always. The observer answers yes without hesitation. Neither man had any idea a Ukrainian recon drone had already logged their coordinates 4 days earlier. The howitzer in question wasn't sitting the full 30 kilometers back. Intelligence, gathered by the 92nd, placed it at just under 9 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian position, tucked into a stand of trees near the outskirts of a village called Kyslivka. The crew had displaced forward temporarily, closer than doctrine allowed, to support a push near the settlement of Novusinov. It was supposed to be a 48-hour repositioning. It stretched into 9 days. Achilles found it on day 6. Discovery didn't come easy. For close to 3 weeks before that, the unit's long-range reconnaissance drones had been getting nothing off that tree line, day after day of empty thermal footage, while command kept pressing for results. Heavy cloud cover through most of May had grounded a lot of the higher altitude ISR platforms Ukraine normally relies on to cue artillery and drone strikes, and low-level recon flights kept getting chased off by Russian short-range air defense working the sector. A Pantsir S-1 battery believed to be covering the artillery group from a position roughly 6 kilometers northeast. SIC described it as flying blind for most of a month. The unit adapted by shifting recon flights to the narrow weather windows between fronts, sometimes launching at first light for a 10-minute window before the clouds rolled back in. By the last week of May, Achilles had a heat signature, a tree line, and a rough firing schedule. What they didn't have yet was a confirmed target type. That gap would close faster than anyone expected, and what filled it would turn a routine reconnaissance mission into the 6-week operation this file is actually about. Command flagged the position as a priority target the moment a second recon pass, flown on May 21st, caught something SIC's team hadn't seen before. A long, low-profile chassis under camouflage netting, with a turret silhouette that didn't match any of the towed or wheeled artillery Russia usually parks in that sector. Ukrainian military intelligence cross-referenced the thermal signature against known Koalitsiya deployments along the Eastern Front and came back with a confidence rating high enough to greenlight a dedicated strike team. What's most surprising about this case isn't that Achilles found the gun. It's how long it took Russia to notice it had been found. For 6 full days after that May 21st recon flight, the battery kept firing from the same position, on the same rough schedule, as if nothing had changed. SIC's commanding officer, a company-level lead who goes by the call sign Borislav, put it bluntly in an interview for this file. The Koalitsiya's crew had spent so long believing they were untouchable that they never checked whether it was still true. Planning the strike took 12 days. Fiber-optic FPVs are slower and heavier than their radio-controlled cousins, weighed down by the spool of cable trailing behind them. And most fielded systems in 2026 top out around 15 kilometers of usable line before signal degradation or physical cable limits force the drone home. 9 kilometers to the target sat comfortably inside that range, but the terrain didn't cooperate. Direct line of sight from Achilles' nearest safe launch point ran straight through a shallow valley studded with tree lines, power line corridors, and at least one collapsed rail bridge, any one of which could snag or sever a cable thinner than fishing line. The unit's engineers solved it with a relay. 2 drones would fly the mission in sequence rather than one. The first, piloted by a second operator call sign Griff, would lift off from a forward position and fly roughly 4 kilometers to a wooded rise, landing gently enough to set down a second spool intact. From there, SIK would take over on a fresh line, flying the remaining 5 kilometers to the target itself. It's a technique Ukrainian units have been refining since late 2025, essentially building a fiber-optic relay chain the same way old field telephone crews used to string wire hop by hop across a battlefield. Here's the part that still doesn't sit right with me. Everything about the Koalitsiya-SV's design, on paper, should have made this strike nearly impossible. Its range was supposed to keep it out of drone reach entirely. Its armor, rated to stop small arms and shell fragments across the frontal arc, should have shrugged off anything smaller than an anti-tank round. Its autoloader, the system Russian state television spent years praising as revolutionary, was supposed to be the gun's single greatest strength. It turned out to be the opposite. And the reason why is the actual heart of this story. The relay flight itself almost didn't happen. On the night scheduled for the strike, May 26th, Griff's drone clipped an unmarked agricultural fence wire roughly halfway to the relay point, snapping the fiber line and forcing an abort less than 90 seconds into the flight. The team scrubbed the mission, reset the spool, and tried again the following night with a slightly adjusted route that added nearly a kilometer to the relay leg. It worked, just barely. SIK later said the spare spool very nearly ran out before he ever reached visual range of the tree line. What strikes us about this whole sequence is how much of modern precision warfare comes down to problems this mundane. Not electronic countermeasures, not billion-dollar radar. A fence wire nobody marked on any map, almost derailing a strike on a $5 million howitzer. That gap between how sophisticated this war looks in press releases and how improvised it actually is on the ground is, frankly, the whole story of this conflict. At 22:40, on May 27th, SIK took the second leg controls. His screen showed a grainy night vision feed, cable spool ticking down meter by meter on a readout taped to the side of his monitor. 5 kilometers of tree line, open field, and 1 collapsed drainage ditch stood between his launch point and the target coordinates Achilles had been tracking for 6 days. He made it to visual range in 11 minutes. What he found waiting under that camouflage netting wasn't just a howitzer. It was a howitzer with its crew still loading the next fire mission. Muzzle flash from an earlier shot still cooling in the night air, utterly unaware that anything was 50 meters off their flank. What happened in the next 90 seconds is the part of this story that made it all the way up the Ukrainian chain of command. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. Russia's decision to keep exposing its scarcest, most expensive artillery pieces on a front line, this saturated with drones, wasn't bad luck. It was a choice, repeated over and over, that prioritized firepower on the ground over the survival of hardware Moscow can't easily replace. With fewer than 20 Koalitsias built as of 2026 and production numbers that have never come close to matching Russian artillery losses elsewhere, sending this specific gun 9 kilometers forward of a standoff line drawn for an older generation of threat reads less like confidence and more like an institution that hasn't updated its own doctrine fast enough to keep its own soldiers alive. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. If a $5 million near-prototype weapons system can be found and destroyed by a drone that costs less than $500, what does that say about every other high-value asset Russia is still parking within striking distance of a front line saturated with FPV teams? It's not a rhetorical question. Drop your answer in the comments, because Ukrainian analysts are asking it too, and the answer shapes how both sides fight the rest of this war. The Koalitsiya's autoloader sits in the turret bustle, a rotating carousel packed with live, 152mm propellant charges and shells, mechanically fed into the breech to sustain that impressive rate of fire. It's an efficient design. It's also, structurally, almost identical to the turret ammunition layout that has doomed hundreds of Russian tanks since 2022, the same carousel autoloader arrangement that turns a single penetrating hit into a catastrophic secondary explosion. Western analysts had flagged this vulnerability in open-source assessments of the Koalitsiya as early as 2023. Russian engineers apparently decided the trade-off in rate of fire was worth it. Sixth target for the first drone wasn't the crew compartment. It was the hatch covering that ammunition carousel, a roughly 40-centimeter panel on the turret's left rear quarter that Ukrainian intelligence had identified from earlier captured or destroyed Koalitsiya wrecks as the weak point in the whole design. Hitting a moving 40-centimeter target from a drone flying at speed, at night, at the end of a 9-kilometer fiber-optic tether is not an easy shot. SIC had one attempt. Fiber-optic drones don't have the maneuverability margin radio-controlled FPVs do, and a missed pass usually means the aircraft is out of cable, out of options, and effectively dead in the field. He didn't miss. The drone struck the ammunition hatch at 22:52. For roughly 2 seconds, nothing visible happened. Then the turret went up. What the strike footage shows next is the kind of thing that doesn't need narration. The initial impact ignites the propellant charges stacked in the autoloader carousel. That ignition, in turn, sets off the ready-to-fire shells stored alongside it. The combined blast has nowhere to vent, except straight up through the turret ring, and on a Koalitsiya-SV, that means the entire unmanned turret, gun barrel and all, launches clear of the hull. In the raw video, it's airborne for what looks like a full second and a half before it comes down in a field roughly 11 meters from where the vehicle had been parked. Secondary explosions continue for close to 90 seconds afterward as remaining shells inside the wreck cook off one by one. 3 crew members were reported inside or near the vehicle at the time of the strike, according to Ukrainian battlefield assessment. Achilles could not confirm casualties with certainty, and this file won't claim more than what the footage and intercepted Russian radio chatter afterward actually support. What the intercepts do show is a Russian unit in the immediate area reporting in the minutes following the strike that they'd lost contact with the position entirely and that, quote, the gun is gone, not damaged, gone. There's one detail in the aftermath footage that stuck with me more than the explosion itself. About 4 minutes after the strike, a second Russian vehicle, believed to be a resupply truck, pulls up to what's left of the position, headlights cutting through drifting smoke, before reversing hard and driving off in the opposite direction without stopping. Whoever was in that truck clearly understood faster than command back at headquarters did that the position wasn't safe anymore, that whatever had just happened here could happen again. It didn't need to happen again, not to make the point. One Koalitsiya-SV, out of a national inventory, Western estimates place somewhere between 12 and 18 total units as of mid-2026, no longer exists. Put that fraction in perspective. Losing even a single-digit percentage of a fleet this small isn't a rounding error the way losing one T-72 out of several thousand would be. It's closer to losing one aircraft out of a squadron. Every single unit matters, and Russia's own defense industry, squeezed by sanctions and years of sustained production strain, has never demonstrated the capacity to replace Koalitsiya-SV hulls at anything close to a meaningful rate. Within 72 hours of the strike, according to signals intelligence reviewed by Ukrainian analysts, artillery units across the broader Kupiansk-Svatov axis began shifting standoff distances outward, in some cases doubling the old 30-kilometer benchmark for high-value systems specifically. Whether that change traces directly back to this one strike or reflects a wider pattern across the front is impossible to say with total certainty. What is certain is that the timing lines up, and that Russian gunners in that sector have been noticeably more cautious about forward repositioning ever since. Here's what this tells us about where this war actually is right now, 3.5 years in. It isn't a story about drones replacing artillery, or cheap technology beating expensive technology in some clean, satisfying way people like to package for a headline. It's messier than that. A $5 million howitzer with a genuine range advantage still lost to a 9-kilometer fiber-optic drone flight that nearly failed twice because the doctrine protecting that howitzer was written for a threat that had already evolved past it. Technology didn't win here. Adaptation did. The side that noticed the battlefield had changed and updated fast enough to exploit it before the other side caught up. Put yourself in that Russian battery commander's position for a second. You've been told by your own command structure, by state media, by years of training doctrine, that 30 kilometers of standoff makes you safe. You displace forward for 9 days because the mission demands it, trusting a rule that used to be true. Somewhere on the other side of that tree line, a 26-year-old who used to fix farm equipment is watching your position through a drone you have no way of detecting. On a control link, your electronic warfare systems cannot even see, let alone jam. We cut one detail from the main narrative of this file for length, something about how Achilles actually verified the kill after the strike that we couldn't fully confirm on camera before publishing. If you want the full account of that verification process and how Ukrainian units are increasingly cross-checking fiber-optic strikes against satellite and signals intelligence before claiming a confirmed destruction, drop a comment saying so, and we'll cover it properly in a follow-up. Achilles has since returned to the same general sector of the Kupiansk axis at least twice more, according to unit sources, though neither of the subsequent operations targeted anything as high value as the Koalitsiya-SV. Sish, for his part, said in his interview that he doesn't think about the specific strike much anymore. For him, it was one flight out of dozens, notable mainly for how close the cable came to running out. For the Russian military, and for the doctrine writers who set that 30-kilometer standoff rule, it should have been a wake-up call. Whether it actually was one is something only the next few months on that axis will answer. What's clear is this. The Koalitsiya-SV FPV was supposed to be the gun that proved range and armor still mattered more than a $500 quadcopter. Instead, it became one more entry in a growing list of Russia's most advanced systems, undone by exactly the kind of unit this channel exists to document. A handful of pilots, a spool of glass fiber, and 6 weeks of patience against a machine that never once suspected it was being watched. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe, because we're already tracking the next confirmed strike out of the Kupiansk axis, and it involves a target Russia has protected even more carefully than this one. Leave a comment with what you think Russia changes next, because the answer to that question is going to shape how the rest of this front plays out.